There is an economic condition that standard theory said was impossible. Rising prices, rising unemployment, stagnant growth, all three simultaneously. Before 1973, most economists believed these forces canceled each other out. Then reality disagreed. This is the story of stagflation, how it was created, how it was cured, and why the Federal Reserve just named it their biggest fear for 2026. To understand stagflation, you need to understand what economists believed before it happened. The Phillips curve, established in 1958 by A.W. Phillips. A simple observation: when unemployment is low, inflation tends to be high, and vice versa. They move in opposite directions. You cannot have both at the same time. For 15 years, this held. The 60s were a golden decade for economic management. Low unemployment, manageable inflation, steady growth. The economists called it the Great Moderation. They believed they had solved the business cycle. They were wrong. The flaw in the Phillips curve was that it assumed all inflation comes from demand. When too many dollars chase too few goods, prices rise. But what if the supply of goods collapses suddenly? What if costs rise not because people are spending too much, but because it suddenly costs more to produce everything? That is called a supply shock. And October 17, 1973, delivered the largest supply shock in modern history. October 17, 1973, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced an oil embargo. Target: the United States and its allies. Reason: American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Within 90 days, oil prices quadrupled, from $3 to $12 per barrel. This was not a gradual shift. It was a structural shock to the entire American economy. America in 1973 ran on cheap oil. Every supply chain, every factory, every suburb, every car. When oil quadrupled, the cost of almost everything quadrupled with it. Inflation hit 12%. The Fed raised interest rates, but higher rates do not drill new oil wells. They do not rebuild supply chains. The inflation continued. The economy slowed. Unemployment rose anyway. Three conditions that were supposed to be mutually exclusive occurring simultaneously. The word coined by British politician Ian MacLeod in Parliament: stagflation. By 1979, inflation had reached 13%. Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as Federal Reserve Chairman. Volcker's diagnosis was different from his predecessors. The problem was not just energy costs. The problem was that American households and businesses expected inflation to continue, so they asked for higher wages. Companies raised prices to cover higher wages, which created more inflation, which created more wage demands, an inflationary spiral. Volcker's prescription: break the expectation brutally. On October 19, 1979, he announced the new policy. The Fed would control money supply. Rates would go wherever necessary. They went to 20.06%, the highest federal funds rate in American history. Mortgage rates exceeded 18%. The housing market froze. Business investment collapsed. Unemployment hit 10.8% by 1982. 1 in 10 Americans out of work. Volcker received death threats. Farmers drove tractors to the Federal Reserve Building in protest. But the medicine worked. Inflation collapsed from 13% to 3% by 1983. The economy began to recover. Reagan declared mourning in America, and Paul Volcker became the most celebrated central banker of the 20th century. The man who deliberately broke the economy to save it. This week, the Federal Reserve held its benchmark rate at 3.5 to 3.75%.
At the same time, multiple institutional forecasts confirmed the same three conditions. Inflation, 3.5% and rising toward the middle of 2026, according to RBC, RSM, and Apollo, confirmed this week. Job growth, 50,000 per month, down from 168,000 in 2024. GDP growth, under 2%. These three conditions have a name. Economists at RBC called it stagflation light. KPMG's chief economist said, quote, "I have never seen anything like it." The causes in 2026 are different from 1973. There is no single oil embargo, but there is a tariff regime that raised effective import taxes from 2 to 12%. There is AI displacement, 50,000 jobs per month, a structural labor market shift. There is a debt trap, $39 trillion in national debt, interest payments exceeding the defense budget. Different supply shocks, same structural impossibility. The Volcker solution, raise rates dramatically, is theoretically available, but Powell's term ends in May 2026. His successor, almost certainly more politically aligned with the White House, is unlikely to deliver a Volcker-level shock. The inflation expectations are not yet spiraling, but the conditions that created the 1973 spiral are present. Supply-side costs rising, rate increases politically constrained, and the Phillips curve once again failing to predict the situation. Here is what history ultimately teaches about stagflation. It is not primarily a monetary problem. Volcker could control money supply. He could not control oil prices, supply chains, or geopolitical embargoes. What he could control, and did, was expectations. He made the market believe the Fed would do whatever it takes, and that belief, held long enough, became reality. In 2026, the question is not whether stagflation conditions exist. The data says they do. The question is whether the next Fed chair will do whatever it takes, or whether political constraints will allow stagflation to settle in permanently, the way it did in the 1970s, when the disease becomes accepted as the new normal. Volcker himself, in his memoirs, wrote, "The greatest danger in monetary policy is not making the right decision, it is making no decision at all, and calling the inaction stability." The shadow ledger, financial history that explains the present. If stagflation is the question that 1973 posed, 2026 is waiting to see if the answer has changed.